record. Thank you so much for joining us for the May Cannabis Industry Meetup. Our guest tonight is Jason Klimek. He's an attorney with Barclay Damon, and he is a wealth of knowledge. And so please keep yourselves muted and put any questions into the chat. And Jason, take it away.
What am I taking away? Where do I start? What do I start with?
How about what we know so far about and what not to do? Like, how about we start off with like the myth of the gift giving?
Gotcha. Okay, so contrary to a lot of public belief, and for some reason, a few district attorneys' offices who aren't quite sure of the law, it is unequivocally illegal to have gifting shops or sticker shops where you go in and you buy a t-shirt and get a free bag of cannabis, or buy a sticker, or even like go to an event where you make a donation, and all illegal. Those are all commercial transactions for cannabis. It doesn't matter what you call it. So the Office of Cannabis Management, this isn't just my opinion, the Office of Cannabis Management has many times over the past 6 months or so announced this. The chair, Tremaine Wright, has stated this a whole bunch of times, and we understand that soon there's going to be some enforcement action against these places. Previously, about a month ago, they issued basically kind of cease and desist letters to, I think it was about 25 shops that they knew about, where they basically said, you know, you need to stop this. This is illegal under the law. And if you don't stop, you jeopardize your ability to get a license. And there could be criminal or civil penalties on top of that. So understand that that is illegal right now. And yeah, we don't, other than the medical dispensaries, of which in Rochester there's 2, there is no technical legal way to buy cannabis in New York at the moment. But they have issued, or they have the proposed conditional dispensary regulations, which mean that, well, they have said that they hope to have the applications available for those conditional dispensaries, I think by like June or July through early fall will be the application period. And so hopefully, if it's anything like the conditional cultivator licenses, they'll do that very quickly, where people will be submitting, and then within a few weeks, they'll start issuing those licenses. So hopefully very soon, within the next few months, there will be dispensary licenses issued.
Cool. You did tell me a great analogy of, you know, if you interchange cannabis with sex and it sounds remotely like prostitution, that it's not right. So that's kind of like a good, and I told that to another attorney that was at a conference with me, and she's like, that is brilliant. She's like, I wish I had thought of that. So, you know, kind of if you replace cannabis with sex, if it sounds like prostitution, then no. Right.
Yeah, essentially, you know, if this whole gifting and sticker thing was legal, some enterprising prostitute would have figured out to charge for t-shirts instead of sex. And right. So that's the analogy, because you couldn't use other illicit drugs, like example, heroin or something like that, because that's illegal. But yeah, it works in the realm of prostitution like that. So yeah, I mean, and I had spoken to former law enforcement officials, and I said, you know, I know this is illegal, but I'm not a criminal lawyer. Like, how is this illegal? How is this prosecuted? And they explain the whole thing. And they're like, yes, there's zero gray area. Like, we have prosecuted these types of cases before. We know exactly how to do it. It's not legal. So yeah, despite the fact that I literally talked to somebody yesterday who, it was down in New York City, who told me that they had several cannabis stores. I was like, what do you mean by that? And they're like, oh, the sticker shops. I'm like, yeah, you need to stop. So yeah, hopefully we will see some enforcement action because it's a public safety issue. You know, those shops are operating in daylight, broad daylight, strip malls, things like that, that as a consumer, it looks legal. And so you think you're getting a regulated, safe product, but you're not. You don't know how that was grown, what's in it. So, you know, there's a public safety issue.
So one of my questions is, the Office of Cannabis Management has said that you will not be able to import any cannabis into New York from other states, but they acknowledge that what New York farmers and growers can produce is nowhere near sufficient to satisfy, like, you know, the market. Do you have any sense of like what the ramifications are for using another state's product if a dispensary opted to do that?
Federal prison.
Federal prison.
No, seriously, like that
Well,
is,
yeah, it's
so the federal government has effectively said, look, if it's legal in the state and you're compliant with the state laws and you're not selling to kids, we don't really care, like hands off, like, you know, whatever. You cross a state line, particularly with quantity, you are on the federal radar. That is where the FBI will come find you because that's interstate trafficking, and that is one of their big no-nos. Like that's a bad thing to do. And it's actually interesting you bring up the supply thing because I've heard it from, you know, very, very knowledgeable people that, you know, they're saying that there's going to be an undersupply. However, I was just having a conversation with somebody today, was in the cannabis industry in Massachusetts, actually ran a cannabis company, a very knowledgeable guy on like the actual operation of cannabis and, you know, very data oriented. Him and I like to nerd out on data stuff. And he was saying the exact opposite. He was saying that New York, just off the conditional licenses, is poised to have a massive oversupply. And he said that he had the data, and I was like, hey, send me something so that I can see it. Because I mean, if this is an issue, we need to like let people know. So it's very interesting because yes, I have absolutely heard that, you know, particularly lately, that people were like, oh my God, we're not going to have enough supply. And I think they're very worried about the supply at the dispensaries that they're setting up, these first, call it 150 conditional dispensaries, because those are the ones that are getting the funds from the social equity grant, the $200 million. The state is providing the locations. So if those don't have cannabis, they're not going to survive. Like they need revenue to survive. So, you know, that would obviously be like a horrific PR nightmare for the state. And you have these equity applicants that are trying to overcome the adversity and, you know, penalties for, or the, you know, the issues from cannabis prohibition, and then to have them fail because New York wasn't able to supply enough, it'd be terrible. So, yeah, it's a huge issue. But don't bring anything from out of state.
So we've talked before about because it will be a cash-based business, of the likelihood of being audited by the IRS. So could you review that as well as like the concept of the 280E?
Yeah. So federal taxes suck for cannabis. Like there's no better way to put it. It's brutal. So one statistic that I think, you know, kind of puts things into perspective is, and this came from 2013, so I'm sure it's even worse now, but on a normal audit, like an audit of a regular business, the IRS, for every man hour worked, returns about like $500 for the government. In cannabis audits, it's $1,300. So they know where to put their dollars because they can make a lot of money back to the government, because cannabis companies are basically incentivized to try to take very, very risky positions because the federal taxation is so brutal in certain cases. And it's an all cash business. So it's a lot harder to trace everything than when you have all types of electronic records. So, you know, there's a big issue there And the cause of it is, as you mentioned, 280E. So 280E is the federal tax law. I'll give you a little history lesson. So back in, I think it was 1980, 1982, there was a tax court case for a drug dealer, illicit drug dealer, who the IRS came after him because he was taking regular business deductions. He's a drug dealer, he's dealing controlled substances, but he was taking deductions like your average business. And he won in tax court because there was no law that said he couldn't. So Congress was not having that. So they enacted Section 280E. Section 280E says if you traffic in a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substance, cannabis being a Schedule 1, you are denied all deductions and credits except cost of goods sold. So what does that mean? The easiest and most brutal example is for a dispensary. Your cost of goods sold is the cannabis that you buy, and that's it. Your rent, your utilities, your wages, insurance, all of those expenses are not deductible because those are not cost of goods. So it's a really big issue because you can have, for example, we can put some numbers to it. Let's say that you sell cannabis all year and you make $1 million. That's your revenue. And your cost to buy that cannabis was, call it 600,000. And your other expenses, your rent, your utilities, so on and so forth, were 200,000. So in a normal business, that would leave you with $200,000 of profit. You would get taxed on that 200,000, call it at 30%. So you pay the government 60 grand and you walk away with $140,000 at the end of the year. That's your money that you get to take home. That is how a normal business operates. In cannabis, though, that's not the case. You would get to deduct that 600,000, but the 200,000 that you spent on other stuff, you don't get to deduct. So the government says, no. You made $400,000 of profit. So we're going to tax you on 400,000. So if assuming a 30% tax rate, 400,000, that's 120 grand. Now remember, you really only had 200 grand. That was your real profit. So at the end of the day, instead of being left with whatever I said earlier, you're left with $80,000. Like that's a huge hit. So that's how 280E works in a nutshell. It's pretty brutal. Really at the dispensary levels too. Dispensaries can have tax rates between 70 to 90% when you add all this stuff up. It gets a little better as you move up the chain. So like the processing and cultivation, you can add more things into cost of goods because anything that kind of goes into creating the product can at least be partially claimed as a cost of goods. So, your utilities, well, you can't grow a plant indoors without heat. So you can take the lease for the building or the mortgage, things like that. Those become cost of goods. So, the tax rates aren't as bad, but they could be 50 or 60%, where a normal tax rate for a business is going to be 20, 30%, somewhere in there. So cannabis, business taxes are pretty brutal. New York tried to help a little bit because in the budget, Senator Cooney put in a bill to decouple from the federal tax law, because prior to this year, New York had the same rule that if you were a cannabis company, you were denied all deductions except cost of goods. We decoupled now. And so now for at least New York state purposes, you can take those deductions. You're still barred at the federal level, but at least for New York state, you can take those deductions. It helps a little, but the New York state taxes as compared to the federal taxes are relatively minimal. You're talking tax rates somewhere between 5 and maybe like 10% or something like that, as opposed to the federal where, you're anywhere from like 10 to 37%. So, it helps, but the bulk of it is at the federal level, and it's hard. That being said, they're tons of cannabis companies that make money. It just has the effect of making it harder to compete with the illicit market because you're paying these taxes. So it raises the prices at retail, and the illicit market obviously doesn't have that issue. So that's where it really becomes difficult.
So in terms of as someone who's been audited, just as an individual, how important is it to have a CPA prepare your taxes for you? What is that? Does that actually decrease the likelihood of being audited?
I don't know that it necessarily decreases it, but it's going to help a lot to work with professionals who, well, A, work with professionals, but B, professionals who are familiar with cannabis. Because the best thing that a business can do is keep amazing records, because that's going to be your evidence. If you're audited, the IRS is going to say, show us your books. And if you don't have those records of every single thing, they're going to try to piece it together themselves, and they're not going to be generous to you. And so the best thing you can do is track everything meticulously, have a good bookkeeping system, and then work with a CPA, work with an attorney who understands these things and can help guide you along the way, because odds are you're probably going to get audited at some point as a cannabis company. But if you can give the records over to the IRS and say, here's what we did, we didn't take aggressive positions, it'll go relatively smoothly, hopefully. And the IRS says, okay, we agree with what you did. You don't owe us anything. That's it. But yeah, I mean, that's the biggest takeaway is do it right from the start, be as detailed as you can, and hopefully that will save you a lot on the back end.
But given that it's all cash, like how would the IRS know that, this is a legitimate receipt versus,
They have power to request pretty much any documents. They can literally go on fishing expeditions to get whatever they think is going to be relevant. And so the way an audit works essentially is the IRS kind of says, hey, we have an issue. You need to provide us the stuff. If you can't provide them something they want, that burden's on you when they come back and say, nope, this is what we think. Now it's your problem to prove them wrong. So you don't want to be in that position. You want to have those records. If you are in that position, then you got to find those records. You got to do something to show that what they're saying is incorrect and this is the real thing. So the cash, it comes down to bookkeeping, because I mean, it's much easier to have electronic records, credit card checks, things like that. With cash, you literally need to have a ledger that says I paid X amount to this company for this service or whatever it is, so that you can keep track of that and just provide it. Because contemporaneous records taken at the time that it happens are the best evidence for the IRS. Essentially, unless the IRS can prove that you falsified those records, those are going to be the records that kind of carry the day.
So given that it's all cash, is there an electronic system that you could have that transaction take place, but it's still in cash, that would be a reliable record? There's no Square for cash, right?
Not really. So cannabis banking is difficult, but not impossible. There are select banks that will bank cannabis companies, but it's a lot of overhead and compliance. So they're pretty selective on who they choose. But that at least gives you a depository account. You can probably cut checks and stuff like that. So you might be able to actually have electronic records, but at least half the things are going to be in cash. It's just the way it's going to be. People are paying their taxes in cash because they don't have a bank. So there's it's a huge issue, and cash makes everything harder. And the only thing that's being really done about it is there's talk about passing the Safe Banking Act at the federal level, but so far that hasn't really gotten a lot of traction because like one of the actual biggest impediments right now is Senator Schumer and a couple other senators don't want to pass safe banking unless it's part of a larger cannabis reform package. But that larger cannabis reform package has pretty much zero chance of passing in the Senate right now. So we're just kind of at this stalemate. Meanwhile, cannabis companies can't bank, their records become very difficult to use. So it's a big problem. Hopefully New York can come up with an answer. There was, I think, talk, or maybe there was a bill drafted to create like a New York cannabis bank, which would be a tremendous help for the industry. But as far as I know, that hasn't gone anywhere.
So I've done a lot of research on this banking issue for the people that I support in my position. And people seem to think that if you have a state charter versus, a federal charter for the bank, that it's automatically a go, but they state chartered banks can still be part of FDIC. So I keep going to all these meetings where they're just like, just find a state chartered bank. And I'm like, no, because they're part of FDIC. I mean, so do you know of the banks in like Massachusetts or Texas or whatever that are dealing with cannabis businesses? Do they have FDIC status, or are they foregoing that?
I think that a lot of the, at least some of the ones that I'm familiar with, typically like have a subsidiary that deals with cannabis. So they're not commingling with their federally, legal business. And technically banking a cannabis company is not illegal. Like banks can do it. They just have to file suspicious activity reports for every $10,000 or series of transactions that add up to $10,000 cash deposits. There's a lot of compliance, and if they mess up, they can get in real trouble. So that's why they don't like to do it, but there are some that do it. And it's the FDIC issue is really that they can't insure through FDIC the cannabis money. And also they don't want to risk losing access to the federal wire system, because if they get in trouble with the feds and they lose access to that, they pretty much, now they're an island. Like they can't operate really as a bank other than literally putting your money in their safe. Like that's basically.
Yeah, it's a fun fact. Like the Federal Reserve Bank, they are the ones who allow you to do bank to bank transfers and things like that. So I know there's some people out there that want to disband the Federal Reserve if you watch certain channels. But that's actually what allows you to do that. You need to send money to your mom or somebody. That's what that does. Questions for Jason? You got an attorney here who's willing to tell you wisdom, anything. Questions? No questions. Okay, so if we can move on then, still on the banking issue. Do you know of any issues where, I know that if you own a dispensary and you have employees, and then technically, like if they deposited their paycheck in a bank, that could be subject to federal seizure. Do you know if they're actually cracking down on that, or is that just like kind of like a threat that they like to hang over people's heads?
I haven't really heard. I mean, as I said, like the feds really don't do much unless you're breaking state law. So I haven't heard about it. I mean, could it have happened somewhere? Yeah, but there is a rider to, I forget which federal bill it is, but it basically says like the DOJ can't expend funds to go after. It's called the Rohrabacher Amendment. It's specifically for medical companies, but I think they've kind of extended it to adult use companies too, with the whole provision, as long as it's legal in the state of what you're doing, they don't really expend funds to do anything about it. So technically, I mean, is it money laundering? Yeah, technically you're taking illicit funds, giving it to somebody else, filtering it through a bank, and then they pull it out. Yeah, that is like the actual definition of money laundering. But do they do anything? Again, if you're in compliance with state law, usually not. I mean, I haven't heard of anything. These businesses really do operate like regular businesses. Just heavily regulated and killed on taxes, but they do operate like a regular business.
Awesome. We have a question. Thank you, David. What can I do as a business to ease the bank's regulatory reporting burden and make it easier to work with me? Can I provide them with everything they need should the feds come calling? What is that data and how much is it going to cost me to collect?
Basically, the banks are going to tell you what they need. They are going to, they'll interview you, they'll look at business plans, they're going to look at everything and make a determination, do we want to work with you? Are you a risk that we're willing to take on? Because there's a lot of compliance. And then they're just going to request information as it comes up. So again, this goes back to the record keeping of all the records that you can keep, the better. So that if the bank does ask, provide us this, provide us that, we need to know this information, you have it right there. I don't know specifically what they asked, but it all goes back to the record keeping so that if they ask for something or if they need clarification on a transaction or something like that, you'll be able to provide it to them. But that being said, they know what you're doing. So, the bank is aware that you're a cannabis company, which also kind of brings me to another point of don't try to slide it past the bank, like what you're doing. Because there's bad things that can happen if that's the case. First and foremost, they will drop your account, like without notice. So if you had any kind of bills paying or anything pending like that, like that will majorly screw that up. But yeah, record keeping, that's the best thing so that you can provide anything that the bank's going to need. But if a bank agrees to work with you, they'll walk you through the process because any bank that is doing this knows what they're doing because they have teams of lawyers making sure that they're dotting every I and crossing every T. So they will tell you exactly what they need and how to comply with their rules so that it's as legitimate as you can possibly make it and that the feds hopefully won't come in.
Okay, I got one to tax your brain. So if you haven't, like, again, we're going back to employees, because it's a Schedule I drug, are they still taking out like Social Security from paychecks? Because they are.
Oh yeah, you got to withhold.
So they don't recognize it as a legitimate business, but they're going to take your money for Social Security.
Yeah, it's just like it's income, so they don't care. Like the IRS does actually do criminal things, but they don't really care what you're doing. Like you could be running the biggest drug empire in the world, and the IRS doesn't care. They're just like, pay us the taxes you owe us. Like we don't that's it. So it's the same kind of concept is, yeah, you're doing this illegal thing, but you still owe taxes on it. You're still paying an employee. That is wages subject to employment taxes. You have to withhold that because that's the government's money. Yeah, you got to do all of that. And it may not be deductible.
Yeah, exactly. Guys, any other comments? You guys got to have some more questions. Otherwise, Jason and we could do this all night.
Literally, I can talk about this forever.
Okay, so what do you think in terms of security is the number one thing that people have to do to, in terms of liability of, say you have insurance against being, and you're not, if you were robbed and the insurance was like, well, I'm not gonna, reimburse you for that because of X, Y, or Z. Like, what are those holes that the insurance will like pounce on to say, no, we're not gonna reimburse you for that?
I mean, so for one, you want to work with an insurance company that is familiar with cannabis. There's some local ones, but yeah, you need somebody who is specifically going to insure a cannabis company. A regular business insurance is not going to work. And then, I think, I don't know exactly what the insurance companies cover, but it's probably going to work like most insurance is, if you claim something and they have any doubts about what you're claiming, they're going to make you prove it, or they're going to try to disclaim liability to not pay out the claim. So you're going to want, and frankly, you're going to need a good security plan. Like right now for the conditional cultivator licenses, we don't have a lot of guidance on what a security plan requires, but within 30 days of licensure, they had to submit a security plan to show how they were securing the premises. And the big deal about that is really to prevent diversion. Diversion is basically illegal selling. So, you're going to want and probably be required to have some kind of like employee tracking type thing where people are, kind of like tapping in and out of the building or something like that, like making sure that there's some record of who, in terms of employees, goes in and comes out, cameras, so that you're tracking everything, because all cannabis companies are required to use a seed to sale tracking system. So you can't just like take some product and like, oh, it just disappears and no, like they're going to know, like there's an inventory system that, when there's a clone in the production facility, it gets tagged with a QR code. And as it goes through, it gets scanned all the way down to the retail consumer. So they know everything. So, it would show up that something was missing in the seed to sale tracking system. And then you're going to have to go back, review the footage, see who was there, look at the logs, all of that type of stuff, because diversion is going to be one of their biggest issues. And if you think about it, like the answer as to why is obvious. That's tax revenue that they're not getting. Yeah, they don't want they don't want cannabis going out to people illegally, blah, blah, blah. They want their tax money. So, that's one.
It's not that they care about it going out to people. It's they want the tax revenue.
Yeah, I mean, because it's perfectly legal to possess if you're 21 and over. Like it doesn't.
Yeah.
Like so that they're not as concerned about that. They're concerned. Where is this going? Like we're not getting our money. So that's really important, and you want to be able to have a security plan that's going to allow you to track all that stuff. And then the government will come out with regulations. They have them for medical companies now. And so that's probably a good blueprint as to what they're going to look like. And, it requires X amount of cameras of this resolution. You have to keep the tapes for so many weeks or things like that. So it's going to be things like that, but it all really comes down to diversion and who's allowed in there. I mean, I've toured in other states, cannabis companies, and yeah, there's always a log. You got to sign in, sign out. It's all tracked and everything like that to make sure that they know who is in that facility at any given time. So if anything goes missing, they know what happened.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I toured a medical marijuana facility, and yeah, it was very, very, very strict. Very, you can't go here, you can't go there. But just as we're talking about security, our June topic for Cannabis Industry Meetup is intellectual property. So if you are interested in trademarking any logos, or if you actually have any plants that could be patented, that will be in June. And then in July, we're having a security talk. August will be one of the parts about having any type of cannabis business will be having a labor peace agreement, which doesn't mean that you have to have, it doesn't mean your employees have to unionize. It means that you have to be friendly to them thinking about that. So we will have some attorneys talking about labor peace agreements. And then after that, we're going to have someone speak about good manufacturing processes, because that's going to be huge again. So questions. Oh, thank you, Kenley. Which forms of media are allowed to promote a retail business?
We don't know yet. They haven't issued regs on that. So we're still waiting to see. I mean, I would tend to doubt they're going to allow, radio, TV. I don't know if they'll allow billboards or not. There are definitely states that do. A lot, and this was particularly early on in the market, but a lot of cannabis marketing was viral insofar as, street teams going out to events and handing out flyers for dispensaries and things like that. I imagine they will allow some type of regulated advertisement, but it's probably going to look a lot like
cigarettes.
I was going to say more alcohol, because that's where they drew a lot of the regulation from. You can't target to people under, for alcohol, you can't target people under 25, and there's some federal way how they determine that.
Okay, so David says there are the OCM billboards on the buses, cannabis conversations. Oh yeah, that has to do with a series of talks that they're having, David.
That's like public awareness stuff.
Yeah, that's public awareness about like how to get the conditional adult recreational.
Or don't consume and drive.
I think what's different about New York State's launching a cannabis program versus other states we've discussed is that it seems, based on numerous OCM conference calls I've been on, there will be a more clearly laid out plan with regards to banks or credit unions that will be, in theory, step up and made available by the time they issue an actual retail license. The $200 million fund is specific to real estate. So the 200 million is coming from what's called DASNY, which is the Dormitory Authority of the State of New York. And that is what is going to happen is people who get these initial licenses will be given a property, and they will have a certain term in which, after they have to pay back the loan. So it's basically, and it's like, so OCM says it's going to be turnkey, right? You're going to open the door and it's going to be your dream dispensary. Everything's taken care of, the security, but again, at the end of the day, the people getting those locations do have to end up buying them, essentially. So, which is problematic in that if you have a dispensary and you don't own the building, and if your dispensary does not, work out, then who's on the hook to repay these private funds? Because it's a public and private partnership.
Ruben McDaniel, who is a Cannabis Control Board member, in some interview that I was sent, mentioned that the debt would follow the building, so it doesn't necessarily follow the borrower. I don't know exactly the mechanics of what he's talking about there, but that's what he said about it. He also said they would be loans that were somewhere between 5 and 10%, and I think maxing out at 11.5 or something like that. So and right, as you said, that they will be available to these conditional dispensary licensees, which we're estimating are going to be about 150 throughout the state, half of which are going to be located in New York City. But he did specifically say that there would be several in the bigger upstate cities: Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany.
So, Paul, if you can be more clear on speculation is that we won't see the application process open for retail licenses until the end of the year. Oh yeah, that's true. Again,
For
all of the,
regular licenses.
yeah, so what's available right now are conditional. So the conditional adult recreation dispensary, adult use recreational dispensary card, those are conditional. Those are for, I believe, 2 years, and they're non-transferable. So everyone, same thing with the hemp growers, those are conditional licenses that they will then have to reapply for. So just because this group of people gets, a license on this initial round doesn't mean that they will get a license on the other round. It's again looking at like, what are your good business practices? What kind of record keeping do you do? All that stuff. So people are like, no one's being cut out of the equation. So does that, okay, the conditional adult use licenses are being issued to those people who were unjustly criminalized for a marijuana felony, is how I understood it. I don't think it has to be specific to a felony.
Yeah, there's two big qualifications. You had to have a New York cannabis conviction prior to March 31st, 2021. And you had to be at least a 10% owner in a business that was profitable for at least 2 years. If you hit those two threshold conditions, then they have several factors that they use to weight the applicants to see who will make that cut of, between 100 and 200 licenses, including like where you were living at the time you were convicted, and things like that. So
yeah,
yes.
so if you lived, so say you were like 19 and you lived in a very affluent part of Monroe County, that is not going to be weighed as much as someone who grew up in a neighborhood that has been traditionally penalized with marijuana prohibition. So you can say, yeah, I have a conviction, but I was in Pittsford, and my uncle got me off because he's a lawyer, right? So they're being a little more holistic about it than just saying I have a cannabis conviction. Does that make sense, Paul?
And part of that was to like tying it to the business thing was what we speculated. It hasn't explicitly been said, but what we speculated is because those licensees are going to get those loans from the social equity fund, which is public and private, and to try to induce private people to invest into that, they wanted to give them some type of surety that like the people getting these licenses knew how to run a business as well. Because if you're just saying cannabis conviction, there's no guarantee that somebody knows how to run a business. I mean, it's still at the end of the day, a business, and running a business is a skill set. So that's why we think that they tied those two things together.
Yeah. Paul, did that answer your question? That being said, the 102 OCM cultivation licenses have been issued in the past 2 OCM conference calls, which tells me that the state wants the legal supply to be abundant before they issue traditional retail licenses. Well, yeah, because they don't want someone to open up a dispensary and not have anything to sell.
Yeah.
And using the industrial hemp growers as like a baseline is one way to make sure that they know how to grow the plant. And we know that growing outside is not ideal, but at least people have something to sell in the dispensaries until they get to who can grow in terms of indoor growing, But yeah, so they want to be able to have something for people to sell, essentially.
And they can't
that-
get it from the illicit market because it
Right,
has
and they
to be.
can't get it from and they can't import it. So from another state. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, they don't want to legalize it and have these dispensaries and have the dispensaries be out of stock, basically. Yeah, I hope so too, Paul. I mean, but again, in Massachusetts, so Paul says, which is why I think by year's end there will be some sort of banking solution. But there hasn't been a banking solution in Massachusetts. There hasn't been a banking solution in Colorado. There hasn't been a banking solution in any other state where cannabis is legal. The only way that, you know, you need to find a bank that's willing to assume a lot of risk, which is something that people who handle money don't like to do. I mean, I'm with you. I've even called banks in like the Cayman Islands where, like, you know, all good organized crime puts their money, and they said they would not deal with an adult use cannabis company.
Well, the issue too is you have to transport cash, like, you know, because you're getting paid in cash. Even if you have, there's some like point of sale systems that are called cashless ATMs that kind of get around it and so on and so forth. But even if you have that, at least 50% of your sales are going to be in cash. And so you need a way to physically get that cash to the bank. And that a lot of times means transporting mountains of illicit cash over a state line. And so it's
right. And as soon as that cash crosses the state line, then that is subject to federal seizure, correct?
Technically, yes. I think the feds kind of realize the ridiculousness of the whole thing and like won't necessarily, but it was just recently, it was states, it was not the feds, but several states were arresting and confiscating the cash as they were driving from legal state to legal state, because they were saying it's illegal, we can seize it. And so people were losing millions of dollars to these police departments. So, I mean, it's an issue. Now, we know there's some cannabis banks in Massachusetts, and we luckily share a border with Massachusetts. So the odds of it happening, if you were using a bank in Massachusetts, probably pretty low, but technically not impossible.
Question, can Jason address what a legal security program might look like for a dispensary with the amount of cash we would be handling? So if I'm understanding your question, Paul, like what is the minimum that you would need to do in order to be insured for that money that you could potentially lose? Am I interpreting that correctly? From a staffing standpoint and or security?
So we don't really know yet. They haven't issued adult use regulations on that stuff. So you could look to the medical law, the medical cannabis law and regs that break it down. For the medical side, it's going to be a little different. It does give you some information. So for example, I literally just pulled up the regs. So they require at minimum a perimeter alarm, motion detectors, video cameras in all areas that may contain marijuana and all points of entry and exit. And I mean, there's like 12 different things just on their minimum requirements. So, I mean, reading through that, it's, that would give at least probably like a baseline. I very much doubt they're going to scrap the medical security requirements and come up with a whole new regime, because that would probably really annoy the medical companies. So they're probably, if anything, going to just tweak this stuff and maybe add on to the requirements. So this gives kind of a blueprint, but we don't know exactly what they're going to require.
Do you know from other states, are the security guards allowed to be armed?
That I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, I don't, to my knowledge, I don't think the security, I don't think the medical dispensaries here have armed security. I don't know if that's by choice or by law that they can't. I have no idea.
I was looking at, like, there was an article in the New York Times about the dispensaries in Oakland, California. And because people know that there's a ton of cash, and they had armed security, and I'm just wondering if that's something that people, I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. Definitely not. This is not a commentary, but I'm just wondering if that will happen here.
I mean, it's certainly an issue because, right, like you have a lot of cannabis and cash. You are a target and you're publicly disclosed. People know where the dispensary is. So it presents a huge issue. And that's why there's a lot of pressure to pass the Safe Banking Act, is because, particularly out west, there have been a whole string of robberies and killings at dispensaries because people were there with drugs and cash, and they, were being robbed and they died. So it's an issue. And yeah, there are definitely other states that have armed security when you go to the dispensaries and things like that. So we don't know how New York's going to deal with it. I don't think the dispensaries, at least in Rochester, have armed security. But I don't know off the top of my head. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely going to be an issue.
Cool. Questions, guys? Anybody? Come on. Someone's got to have a question. Jason's a super fascinating guy, and he's been doing this for years. He's actually in charge of all cannabis initiatives for Barclay Damon across the state of New York. So you're talking to the preeminent expert here. So
and several other states.
and several others.
Yep.
Yeah. So, let's talk about that one thing that I've already asked you about. So, I've had people approach me to say we want to be a nonprofit, and I tell them that,
Thanks, Glenna.
Yeah, the people that confer nonprofit status is the IRS, and that is a federal agency, and cannabis is illegal at the federal level. And so that will, if you're plant touching, that is not going to happen. I have a lot of questions about legal structure. Jason, if you could speak to, like, you need a minimum LLC, right? I mean, no one wants to do a DBA. That's so if you could go through, like, why you definitely don't want a DBA, why you need a minimum LLC, and ideally, fully incorporate.
Yeah. So, and this is just really like general business advice too. Like, unless you're doing something that is like super, super, super low risk, like you're doing some like very minor consulting or something like that, you should have an entity. Even if you're doing consulting, have an entity. They're not that expensive. Because DBAs, sole proprietorships, general partnerships, you have unlimited liability. So if you're sued, then everything you own, including your house, your car, whatever, is up for grabs, which is a bad thing. If you have an entity, not necessarily the case. There are ways that they can punch through it, but in general, it's only the assets of the entity. So your personal assets are safe from lawsuits in general. So yeah, you want to form some entity, and it really comes down to tax choice, whether you're going to be an LLC or a corporation. It just, it's something that you got to work through with your tax professional. I always say just, you can start with an LLC, and you can pretty much, for the most part, always go to a corporation tax-free. You can just kind of dump the assets into it, but you can't go backwards without getting taxed. So if you have a C corp, if you want to go to an LLC, you have to dissolve the C corp. That's a taxable event. Then put the assets into the LLC. So basically, once you're a C corp, you're probably always going to be a C corp.
So the tax differences are, if you have an LLC, you're taxed once a year, like a normal person. But if you're a C corp, you're filing taxes quarterly, correct?
No, because you're gonna do probably you might have to do estimated tax returns and things like that for self-employment and things in an LLC. What it really is that LLCs have pass-through taxation and C corps have entity tax plus then a dividend tax if you take a distribution. So pass-through taxation means that you're taxed at your personal tax rate. So if you're in the, call it 32% bracket, then, and you could have a partner who's in the 25% bracket. So each of you, if you were 50-50, one would claim income and be taxed at 25%, one would claim income and be taxed at 32%. For a corporation, the way it works is the corporate profits are first taxed at 21%. That's the corporate tax rate for federal. And then if you want to take that profit out of the corporation has to issue a dividend, and that's taxed either at 15 or 20%, depending on your personal income level. So roughly the maximum corporate tax rate, if you include the corporate plus the dividend tax, is like 36.8%. That is about the same as the maximum individual tax rate. The max individual tax rate is 37%. You have to make, I think as an individual, you got to make something around like 500,000-ish to be at that tax rate. For a corporation, you'd have to, you have to make about 400,000 to be at that. If you make less than that, then you're taxed at a 15% dividend rate. So I think that equals out to like a 34% tax rate or something like that.
So if what Jason said did not resonate with you, this is again another reason why you need a CPA to help you with your taxes. We've got a great question. Is there any way to keep an electronic journal of all transactions? Would transactions have to be recorded on paper and kept filed away?
No, you can totally use electronic means, use QuickBooks or an Excel sheet or something. Keep your records and keep them safe. I wouldn't trust paper. I personally hate keeping things on paper. So yeah, no, use electronic, because even if you're not using electronic transfers, you can still manually enter things into an electronic system. So yeah, absolutely. Plus then you can nicely export things, email them.
Right. And it makes it easier to do your taxes. And also, like, if there were a fire or something, all your receipts are not going to go up in smoke, and you still have all that evidence. So again, the IRS, evidence. So whatever you can do to reduce that paperwork and make sure you have a credible, documentation.
Yeah, and just to go back to like the nonprofit thing, one thing that's interesting. So IRS actually came out with an opinion that I believe it said something along the lines of like even a cannabis education company couldn't get a tax exemption because it was educating people on an illicit drug. And so IRS is like, that's not a charitable purpose. We're not going to give you 501c3 tax exemption for that. But if you read the conditional dispensary regulations, one of the qualifications is if you're not a person, you're an entity, you could be a nonprofit and apparently apply for a conditional dispensary license. And that really confused me, because I'm like, how does a nonprofit apply for a federally illegal license? It seemed like that would be an immediate revocation of the license. So like, I don't know what the reasoning there was, and nobody's really talked about that. And I don't even know who would really qualify. But it's interesting.
Yeah, because I've had that question a lot of, we want, because especially with the legacy community, they're very community focused, and they want the whole community to benefit. But there's more than one way to benefit your community that doesn't have to do with 501c3 status. You can have a foundation that gives grants, you can do workforce training, you can, hire people, train them,
I would
things
look
like
into
that.
cooperatives too.
Right.
They're not tax exempt, but they have a lot of those benefits of people being able to work together, split the money and things like that. And so,
Right.
I hear that OCM is very much going to be supportive of those types of endeavors. So those are good ones to look to.
I mean, the pro of a cooperative is everyone has a voice. The con of a cooperative is everyone has a voice. It is a completely democratic, legal structure. Are there any local co-ops? Well, not yet, because again, no regulations have come down. So, I mean, if you want to look at a local co-op, there's like the Abundance Food Co-op. That's a legal co-op. There are agricultural co-ops, but in terms of cannabis co-ops, there are none that are currently legal because the regulations have not come down. But again, I always want to stress to people that come and meet with me that they say, I want to form a nonprofit because I don't want to be the man. I don't want to be that person. And you can be a company, a for-profit company that does good. You can be strategic about who you hire. Whether it's, ex-offenders or, diverse hires, you can be strategic in how you use your profits. So I really caution people, because people say this to me all the time. I want to start a nonprofit. I'm like, well, you can start a business yesterday, but you can start a nonprofit in like 18 months from now, right? With the amount of paperwork and the amount of things that are required. But I want to just remind people that as a for-profit business, you can still support your community.
There's also, it's for-profit, but it's called a B Corp.
Yep.
So they're a benefit corporation where they have like a charter that you're right in your organizational documents, you're committing the company to do some kind of social good. So you don't get any tax benefit from it, but it's literally like the design of the company is to be a benefit to society as opposed to just being purely for profit. Mm-hmm. So that's another option too. We have them in New York. You can look them up.
Yep.
So yeah, you can do that.
Yes. So, I mean, I've heard from people say like, well, you can get a nonprofit status by doing a New York State filing as a nonprofit, but your donors will not be allowed to write off their donations. And that is not the number one reason, but one of the top reasons people donate is to be able to get a tax write-off. And if they can't get that tax write-off, then they're not really inclined to donate to you. So unless you get that federal designation, people don't want to give you huge amounts of money because it's not benefiting them. Jason,
plus
you're laughing.
501c3s do get some really good benefits. Like if you're legitimately tax exempt, like you're sales tax exempt, you can, if you own property, you don't have to pay for property taxes, things like that. I mean, so yeah, 501c3s do get great benefits. Their donations are tax deductible, but until the federal law changes, it's not happening.
They do have restrictions. You can't, well, I know a lot of people violate this, but you're not supposed to campaign or advocate or comment on like any political issues or recommend that people vote a certain way. Now that doesn't happen in a lot of organizations like churches, but there are limitations, you know, so there are expectations that you need to, you know, abide by. So questions. All right, I'm going to ask you a series of random questions, like kind of like back on the Daily Show, like your favorite Woody Allen movie.
Is that one of the questions?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know that.
Really? You don't have a favorite Woody Allen movie?
I can't actually say that I've seen one, so no.
Oh, wow. Your star sign. Like your horoscope thingy.
Oh. What am I? Virgo?
Virgo. Okay. Nice. Favorite color.
Oh boy. I mean, given my job, do I kind of have to say green?
No, you don't.
I feel kind of obligated.
Okay, so cat, dog, or horse?
Oh, dog, definitely. I have a dog.
Okay. Cool. Any other questions for Jason? Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you for joining us again. Next month's topic on June, I think the first Wednesday of June is again on intellectual property. So if you want to trademark your logos, or if you are in plant cultivation and there is a plant that you would like to patent, that goes for asexually reproduced plants only, please join us and we will send that information out to you. And then again in July, security, and August is labor peace agreements. So last call for questions. Okay, well, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Jason, for your time. And we will see you next month.
Hey.